Good afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Andrew Tabler, the Martin J. Gross Fellow in the Institute's program on Arab politics. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend what I feel will be one of the Institute's most important policy forums of this year. As Bashar al-Assad's forces tighten the noose around Syria's largest city of Aleppo, the White House and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry are attempting to negotiate a controversial military cooperation agreement with Russia to combat terrorism and strengthen the failing cessation of hostilities agreement in Syria. At the same time, allegations of regime mass atrocities continue to hang over the battlefield and complicate efforts to reach a political settlement. Major questions remain about the legal implications of the Assad regime's response to the uprising, the nature of Russian and Iranian involvement in the war, and the manner in which the United States and the international community will handle crimes against humanity and war crimes, both in the context of a future settlement in Syria, but also under a new American president. So to discuss what is known of the Assad regime's complicity in mass torture, the targeting of civilians in hospitals, and other issues, the Washington Institute is pleased to host some of America's best minds working and writing on the Syria crisis and the international legal issues surrounding it. To my left is Ben Taub, who is a contributing writer at The New Yorker, where he authored the recent, and I feel, excellent articles entitled The Assad Files, which was on the documentation tying the regime to mass torture and killings, as well as Shadow Doctors, which is more recent, on regime targeting of doctors and hospitals. The reporting on the Assad Files was facilitated by a grant by the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting here in Washington, a great outfit that I have known in the past through my work with the Institute of Current World Affairs, and encourage you to check out not only Ben's work, but their work as well. Second is Stephen Rapp, the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, and currently serves as Global Prevention Fellow at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, and as a Distinguished Fellow at the Hague Institute for Global Justice. And last but not least is Wael Zayat, who is the Senior Policy Advisor on Iraq and Syria to U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations Samantha Power, and a lecturer at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And for those of us that work on Syria, I think he's also one of the most knowledgeable persons in the U.S. government on not only what's going on in Syria, but on the implications of it for the region as a whole. Anyways, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Ben to start out. Just two bits of guidance in all of this. First of all comments here today are on the record, unless instructed otherwise. And second, for those of you that are speaking, as well as those who will be asking questions, please speak directly into the mic, because not only are we being carried on network television, but also we're streaming this live. So in order to get your point across, you're going to have to focus it towards the microphone. Okay, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus.
Speak from the podium, I think.
Okay. Fair enough. I'm going to focus today on presenting the Assad Files, because the targeting of doctors and hospitals, while the pattern evidence is very clear and systematic, the documentation from the internal regime documentation that has been collected that I wrote about focuses on detention crimes, which have affected hundreds of thousands of Syrians, millions when it comes to family members. So in the past 4 years, a group of war crimes investigators who formed a group called the Commission for International Justice and Accountability have smuggled over 600,000 Syrian government documents out of the country. These came from security intelligence facilities that had been captured by rebels, and those rebel commanders knew that the SIJA had investigators on the ground who were ready to receive documents. And so when these facilities were overrun, they would call up one of the SIJA operatives who would then go in, box everything up, all evidence together, so that it could later be sifted through by lawyers in Europe. bury it in the ground or in caves or hide it in abandoned homes until it was possible to move these documents across international borders through very complex negotiations and occasional smuggling routes. And they have amassed this enormous quantity of evidence, which then a large team of international lawyers and translators and analysts has gone through, and they've built a case against the Syrian government, the first of several cases that they're building, which focuses on crimes in detention. And they, using these documents, which come from both Assad's highest level security committee, as well as distant provinces, they have been able to trace and rebuild the chain of command and use this chain of command to link the systematic torture and murder of tens of thousands of people in these detention facilities to a policy crafted by Assad's highest level security committee, approved by the President Assad himself, and then returned for implementation through mid and low level security agents. So this highest level security committee that I'm talking about is called the Central Crisis Management Cell, and it was formed by Assad in March 2011 in response to the ongoing protests. The meeting minutes, the document that references the earliest meeting of the crisis cell suggests that it was formed on March 27th, 2011. And so Assad appointed to this committee his brother, Maher al-Assad. He appointed the heads of the four security agencies: military intelligence, Air Force intelligence, political security, and general or state security. The head of the National Security Bureau, which was the body that coordinated these four intelligence bodies historically since the rule of his father. He also appointed the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Defense. So each of these men, and a few other ad hoc members, each of these men presides over his own chain of command and coordinated their responses and shared arrest lists and shared information passing then the orders that they crafted and or the policies that they crafted then were approved by Assad and then sent back to them for implementation as orders through these multiple parallel chains of command into the distant provinces, so that everyone had the same information and was working towards the same coordinated ends. There was an obsession with coordination. You would find each province, each of the 14 provinces, had its own security committee, which would then was made up of roughly the equivalents of the crisis cell in each province. And these men would then pass their meetings and reports directly up the chain, and they would be getting meetings and reports from the districts and from the sub-districts, to the extent that there's a document link where you find in one of the documents I was going through while working on this story. There's a reference from one of the heads of the crisis cell. He gets a report from 350 miles outside of Damascus in an obscure road near Deir ez-Zor, between Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka province. And it's a report from an intelligence agent who says that they have found a piece of graffiti that says "Down with Bashar" on a water pipe near the road, 350 miles from Damascus, and this is sent to the head of, one of the members of the crisis cell, who then sends back instructions to find the perpetrator of this crime, and they spend a month looking for him, and then send back, sorry, we tried, but we couldn't find him. So this is how linked and how well informed the guys on the top were to the crimes happening on the ground. The crimes, the crackdown at first. I'm not going to go through the history of the crackdown. You all know the system of oppression that followed in the early months, the targeting of protesters for arrest and detention. But the case focuses not just on what happened in those arrest and detention facilities, but the actual policy that targets certain categories of people who were then tortured and murdered in these facilities. And this policy came from a meeting of the crisis cell on August 5th, 2011, for which the CJA has the meeting minutes and has them not only in original form, but also referenced in other documents, communications, as they were sent down the chain of command to these different provinces as orders for implementation. This policy was targeted certain categories of people for arrest and interrogation. It targeted protest organizers, and this is a direct quote, those who tarnish the image of Syria in foreign media. And so You have then the crimes against humanity that then follow are that in the course of the implementation of this repressive but not necessarily criminal plan, the crimes occur, and Ambassador Rapp will talk more about command control responsibility, but in international law, essentially, international criminal law takes into account the fact that the highest level perpetrators are really present at the scene of crime, but they are responsible for the systematic and widespread atrocities perpetrated by their subordinates. Once there was a great system of pressures. The last line of the targeting policy in the crisis cell's instructions instructed mid-level security agents to supply to the head of the National Security Bureau a list of names of security agents who appeared irresolute or unenthusiastic in performing their duties. And so they had to get results. And so what you find when you interview, as there have been thousands of detainees who have survived, have been interviewed by the UN Commission of Inquiry, hundreds have been interviewed by the CIJA. I focused on, for narrative purposes, on one detainee named Mazen al-Hamada, who suffered immeasurably, whose testimony happens to connect the databases not only of the CIJA's regime documents, but also to the Caesar files, which you'll hear more about soon from Hospital 601, where he was detained and tortured further. But in the course of these interrogations of detainees who were kept for months and sometimes years in absolutely inhumane conditions, conditions with, 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 sometimes people held in a single solitary confinement cell for weeks at a time, conditions where in a 10-meter by 3-meter room there might be more than 100 people living together for months and months. People would die of suffocation. People would die from various diseases going around the facilities. People would die when guards would arbitrarily abuse them and their wounds wouldn't heal and they would get infected. And then they would eventually, after however long it took the guards to get through each detainee, they would be taken to a room specifically for interrogation. And these interrogation committees, the Joint Investigative Committees, were part of the crisis cell's plan as well, from the meeting minutes. Once in interrogation, they would be interrogated over the various questions listed in the targeting policy of the crisis cell itself. And when people wouldn't admit to committing various crimes that they hadn't done, for instance, Mazen was a protest organizer. He admitted to having organized protests after his legs were burned by cigarettes. He admitted to sending videos of protests to Al Jazeera. Again, after being further tortured. But that was insufficient because of the system of pressures put on these security agents. They needed larger results, and they needed to be able to create this sort of veneer of a judicial process, which meant a coerced confession system to much more serious crimes. So he was tortured in ways that I don't think I should describe here, but are in the article if you want to read it, to the point where he admitted to terrorism crimes that he hadn't done. And this happened to hundreds and thousands of detainees across the country. Because if the intelligence agents doing these interrogations didn't get results, then they themselves would end up in the cells. And that often happened. There were numerous intelligence agents who became CIJA's witnesses because they too were tortured in detention for having not carried out their duties with enough force. I'll close with just saying that, so the next sort of step in the process was once they had been coerced into confessing to these crimes, after a few more months of detention, they would be forced to thumbprint write-ups of their confessions. Often people were thumbprinting these documents while they were blindfolded. They had no chance to read what they were confessing to. And those who were often released because sympathetic judges took pity on them. That's the case with Mazen. He showed the judge the signs of torture all over his body, his broken ribs, his emaciated torso, and the judge took pity on him and let him go. But other judges would then send them to prisons where they would be, now because they've confessed to these crimes, they have entered a judicial process for which they can be detained legally for however many years. So this is the sort of the siege's case that they built from internal regime documents and from hundreds of witness interviews. But the key thing in terms of prosecution is pinning these crimes on individual criminal responsibility, which they can trace through those documents straight up to the very top.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like Ambassador Rapp to take the podium, please. And just to remind the audience, on my left, over Wael's shoulder, is a monitor that has a compilation of photos, some of which are from Ben's investigation in his two stories from courtesy of himself and his work with the New Yorker. But also we have some of the Caesar photos, which have been provided with permission by Human Rights Watch, and as well as a couple of other aerial shots to show you the sort of general destruction and to give you a little bit of the context of what these three gentlemen are speaking about today. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to the Washington Institute for holding this program and for bringing us back to the issue of the mass atrocities and to the ways in which we can build for the day when those responsible for these horrendous crimes are held to account. We've had a war going on since the uprising became a conflict in late 2011 in Syria for almost 5 years. And hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, have taken to the seas, have taken to the roads, have left home and hearth, left the places where they were formerly secure and are seeking refuge elsewhere. Doing it not just because this is a conflict, and indeed all conflicts cause injury to the civilian population, but this is a conflict fought with the commission of mass atrocities in a way that's made life in Syria for the vast majority of the population simply intolerable and worth taking enormous risks to escape those horrors with their families. I really want to salute Ben's work on these two stories in the New Yorker and worked closely with him. I remember visiting Siege's former office in Brussels, and I think he was there for 2 weeks poring over documents. If ever he wants to end the career of journalist and become a prosecutor, I think he'd be a great asset on any team. But meticulously putting together the information that's there, which is, as I said and was quoted by him, is frankly so much more overwhelming than the kind of evidence we had when we went after those that were responsible for the genocide in Rwanda or the mass atrocities committed in Bosnia or in other crime scenes, atrocity crime scenes across the world. And the biggest evidence of it, and one that I continue to have contact with, is the evidence from the so-called Caesar files. And I was pleased actually to see Caesar recently and see that he's in good shape, that frankly he recently gave a 44-page statement to a magistrate in a European country that he's continuing to cooperate with accountability. But I continue to salute his bravery and the bravery of all of these other individuals that have brought out this solid documentation. But his is some of the most impressive that I've ever seen. I mean, he was a career police, military police investigator who took pictures of crime scenes. And then in 2011, he's in this role together with a team of 10 others in photographing the scores and then hundreds of bodies that are dumped at a hospital every day. And during the course of the time from late 2011 until he defected in August of 2013 at great risk to himself and his family, his group took more than 50,000 photos. And these are photos, and many of you have seen some of them on public display at the Holocaust Museum and at the U.S. Capitol and elsewhere. But they are incredible. And of course, the ones that are shown are often not the worst ones. I've seen most of them and gone through them. And they're people of all ages, most of them starved, but not just starved, with eyes gouged and bones broken, skin burned by chemical agents, signs of scars where organs have been removed, people that were eviscerated by the numbering system that was used. And the most amazing thing, the regime itself, the department sent orders that, and medical professionals came down and held cards in front of each of the bodies with the number of the individual and the facility in which the individual was tortured to death, and the number within that facility. And Caesar went up to his computer every night and put all this in, indexed by the date that it came from and the facility in which this person had died. And by that numbering system, during that period, more than 11,000 people were tortured to death in these facilities in the Damascus area. That's just in the Damascus area. Institutions like 235, the Palestine branch, or 215, 216, associated with state security or military intelligence. And since that time, some 760 of them have been identified. And their families have come forth, and many of them are assisting law enforcement. I met some of the families, and they describe not knowing anything about what had happened often it was their son or their nephew. Talked to some businessmen who are now in the Istanbul area, who were actually in construction business, and the son was making deliveries of or bringing supplies to a job site, and picked up because he came from Daraya, which was known in the Damascus suburbs as an area that had a lot of rebels in it, and therefore he ends up tortured to death. And the next thing his parents see of him is an emaciated, torn and broken individual. And so that's why. I remember talking to these guys. They said, well, we were able to keep doing our business until 2013. But eventually it just became impossible to live. That's why people have taken to the road. And the people that ended up being killed, Ben Taub talked about our friend Mazen al-Amada, who managed to survive, and I just saw him again 10 days ago. He's doing well. He's continuing to fight this fight. He's one of the few people that wants to put himself forward publicly and in news footage. Was working at that time with a documentary crew. I mean, he's still so thin and frankly broken. It almost seems like his arms are on backwards, to be frank. But he continues to talk about his experiences. And he described how multiple times he, who was an oil engineer, worked for Schlumberger or someone in the oil business in the eastern part of the country, who became a secular protester who was actually on his way to deliver some milk formula to the besieged people in Daria at the time that he was arrested. He describes just horrendous situations that were happening inside the facilities, but then periodically amnesties would be announced, and the people that would be amnestied would be the jihadis. To go out and frankly reinforce ISIS and create this perception that Assad attempts to create that it's the choice between the devil and the deep blue sea, that we have to support him, or the deep green sea in that case, or ISIS and nobody else. But he's in fact, by even his release policy, emphasizing that the real enemies are the secular or the moderate opposition in his country. Ben didn't go on to talk about the bombardments. And of course, as an international prosecutor, it is easier, and indeed the case in terms of the detention facilities, to the extent you had hold of the individuals in the intelligence service, all the way up to the top, to the President of the Republic, to be frank, and down through the chain of command into these facilities. Because these are state facilities, and because there's such great notice of what's going on in them, these would be among the easier cases ever prosecuted in international justice, to be frank. Cases involving bombardment are much more difficult, because we know in a conflict where civilians are present among insurgents that there's going to be civilian casualties. It's unavoidable. But in fact, the approach that the Syrians have taken has been so direct and so targeted towards civilian objects and humanitarian objects that case is actually also a very strong one. Ben, in his other article, cites my friends and Physicians for Human Rights. I'm very pleased to be on their board, and they're doing great work in this area. They've documented the number of medical professionals killed, which has now reached more than 700 by the regime. ISIS, on the other hand, 27, which to some extent, even though ISIS crimes tend to be much more visible to us, indicates to some extent the proportion of the crimes that we're talking about in Syria.
That's not just ISIS, that's all rebels.
That's all rebel groups. Well, indeed, I mean, the most recent information that they have and you can see it on the website, because of course some of these killings of doctors are those people that are in the Caesar photos and that have been arrested and tortured. People like Dr. Khan, the orthopedic surgeon from London, who went to the Aleppo area to help and ended up murdered by the regime, as was found by a London coroner's jury. Not always in bombing, but in the bombings, there have been 291 attacks on medical facilities and personnel by Syrian government forces, and 45 by Russian and Syrian government bombing raids together. 24 operations by the opposition. One has been documented to be a coalition strike that I'm sure they would argue unintentionally hit a medical facility. But of course, the way in which they're conducting it is also through a form of siege warfare, perhaps legal in the Middle Ages, but now a war crime. It is a crime to besiege a civilian area, to cut off food and medical supplies, and certainly beyond cutting off medical supplies, of course, to intentionally target medical ambulances. Indeed, I know Ben was describing how ambulances used to show their Red Cross or Red Crescent. Now they go around in muddy vehicles because they know if they're in a white vehicle, and it's known as the humanitarian mission, they're going to be among the first targets. And indeed, in this context, it is so much more dangerous, frankly, to be a civilian, to be a humanitarian actor, than it is to be a soldier or a rebel. Now we have reports. I don't know if you saw the report from my good friend Roy Gutman, who won a Pulitzer over reporting in Bosnia in 1993. He's spent a great deal of time in Syria. He wrote on Sunday about what he read, and which many read, as the threat by Putin and by Russia to employ the so-called Grozny rules in regard to Aleppo. Basically, a declaration: get out, or you're all dead. And and this is part of why they've announced with sort of humanitarian fanfare that they were opening up these 4 corridors for people to leave. We know the history of these corridors, the dangers of people being pulled away from those that may be leaving, families separated, the absence of a safe place to go even at the end of the route. But it doesn't make any difference if it were an interstate highway lined by UN blue helmets with well-supplied dormitories at the other end, to make that kind of declaration and then to turn around and target everybody that doesn't leave with indiscriminate bombing or by unleashing brutal killers on the ground is murder as a war crime, full stop. It's also extermination as a crime against humanity. And as we saw from Grozny and the large presence of Chechens now in ISIS, it does not destroy terrorists, it creates them. And rather than establishing the rule of law, it fosters impunity and licenses criminal conduct. It's unthinkable that anyone would believe that the Putin government was playing a constructive role in Syria, or think that we could succeed against ISIS by making common cause with Putin and Assad to go against that group. Individual Russian leaders and commanders are now in danger of being charged as aiders and abettors of Assad's war crimes, based upon the information from Physicians for Human Rights. But implementing Grozny rules and doing that kind of thing in Aleppo, formerly the largest city in Syria, would threaten to make them direct perpetrators in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, what does that all mean? Where people are going to be held to account for these crimes? First of all, I want to note that the day of accountability will come. I'm not talking about going to the ICC. The ICC, as we know, the idea of referring it, supported by the United States, supported by 13 members of the UN Security Council in 2014, the referral to the ICC was blocked by Russian and Chinese vetoes. It doesn't require necessarily, though we'd much prefer it, an internationalized court or even a future Syrian court, though that's really what we want to see, a Syrian court broadly representative of the communities in Syria working with international partners. There's jurisdiction now to prosecute these crimes. And their perpetrators, they're now coming within range of prosecutors with the jurisdiction and the capacity to go after them. First of all, it's because of the documentation that has been brought out. And Ben has described the work of my good friends in CIJA and their 600,000 pages, which is soon being augmented by several 100,000 of additional pages that have recently left Syria. Other organizations are part of that as well. Close to 1 million pages of this kind of documentation, and it's quite impressive. When I was with Mazen the other day, by the way, we had done a search on the documents. These are in written Arabic, which is not that easy to do optical character recognition with, to see if there was any mention in the 600,000 pages that have been scanned at CIJA of Mazen Hamada, and we found the logbook of his arrest. His name, say, arrest him and certain of his friends. And he was quite moved to see that, and then suddenly became emotional because he said, and all the friends arrested with me are now dead. I'm the only survivor. But it's an amazing thing to actually find the documented order that began this. So, and I know recently I was involved in the Habre case in Africa, where fantastically strong evidence was discovered against President Habre 10 years after he was overthrown, of his hand on the torture instruments, saying nobody should leave, or on the documents about the torture, no one should be allowed to leave this prison alive. The strength of that evidence created finally the dynamic even to prosecute him, and he was recently sentenced for life in prison by a mixed court in Senegal, established with a partnership between the U.S. and the AU and the government of Senegal and the EU. So when you have strong evidence, it's impossible to ignore. You will find a way, but it's better than that. One, there's jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction today, in countries where some of the victims were dual nationals or nationals. We see an example of that in though it was only a civil lawsuit, but it certainly tells you what's coming. The case brought by my good friends, not CIJA, but the Center for Justice and Accountability out of San Francisco, in the case of Marie Colvin, an American citizen, one of the greatest journalists of her age, murdered in Syria on the 22nd of February, 2012. And it's a 33-page complaint, and I urge you to go to it. Work closely with them. They mine the CIJA documents. They've identified the responsible parties. Maher al-Assad, directly responsible, the brother of President Assad, the head of the 4th Armored Division. General Ali Mamluk, the head of the Intelligence Directorate, head of intelligence for the Ba'ath Party, directly responsible for her murder. They specifically located where this journalism center was and intentionally bombarded it, bracketed it, killed her and her French photographer, Remy Oclick, and of course injured others that are still with us in journalism. That gave rise to a lawsuit in American court under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, extremely strong case. There's also witness testimony that directly ties these individuals, and we've been successful in relocating the families of those witnesses in other countries so that they're secure also to testify in other cases. But keep in mind, this makes these individuals also responsible for murder under American law, because the murder of an American citizen is murder first degree under the laws of the United States. This opens up the possibility of a case by the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Division of the U.S. Department of Justice that has already prosecuted people like Charles Taylor Jr. I was prosecuting Charles Taylor Sr. in The Hague. The U.S. attorney in Miami prosecuted Charles Taylor Jr. and sentenced him to prison for 97 years. So these are the kind of cases that can can be made. The French, as well, who have an active investigation, as announced by Foreign Minister Fabius in January of 2015, can prosecute these individuals as well under their law, and they have an open investigation. There's also, of course, and keep in mind, these individuals aren't turning up in Washington, and anytime soon, but this certainly creates a situation where there are more than 100 countries in the world where they can't safely go now until the day they die. But we also have perpetrators that are beginning to come out of Syria. Of course, many associated with the opposition. But as my friends at CIJA have shown, and we're working with a number of European prosecutors, you'd be amazed at some of the torturers that are now among the refugee population and that can be identified and that are being pointed out by the survivors. Those are cases that can be prosecuted under present-in jurisdiction. Crime committed elsewhere. If the perpetrator is present in your country, you can prosecute the crime. I was with at the EU Day Against Impunity at the end of May. The Dutch, who were the president of the European Council for the first 6 months of 2016, on the 29th of May, established the first European Day Against Impunity to salute the work of the European Network. The United States is part of the European Network. There are 32 countries whose prosecution units work in conjunction with each other. There are 14 of these prosecution units that have already successfully prosecuted persons for responsibility in the Rwandan genocide and other atrocities committed abroad. And they're each working on Syrian cases today. So I want to be clear to those who might think that with the Syrian regime, this might be the way of the future, but that the massive crimes that they've committed, the crimes that have led to the greatest flow of refugees in human history, and indeed we have more people on the road as refugees than we had in World War I or World War II, 65 million today, and so many of them coming out of this conflict zone, that the day of justice is arriving, and those who commit these crimes will face consequences. And for those victims and those people that are working to help document these crimes, who are so discouraged because they're often seen that the world would not stand with them as they suffered the bombs, as their eyes were gouged out, as their children were hacked to death, as their tortured bodies were returned to their parents, as occurred and as shown in the Caesar rolls in the early part of the uprising, that those individuals, I think, need to take heart that justice is possible, that the evidence is being preserved, and that they should come forward and assist investigators and prosecutors so that we can begin to deter these atrocities and increase the chances that those that would otherwise would take flight will be safe with their families in their homes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those moving remarks. Well, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Ambassador, look, as somebody who was born and raised in Syria, I have no doubts that eventually those responsible will be held responsible. And they will face their day, whether in court or before their own people or before prosecutors such as yourself. So I commend you on everything that you're doing, and I commend you, Ben, on what you're doing. Thank you, Andrew, for highlighting this issue and giving it its due importance. The focus is usually on ISIL and Nusra, on various terrorist organizations that are detestable and must be rooted out. But the overwhelming atrocities in Syria are taking place on a daily basis on the behest of the Syrian regime. So on that, there can be no doubt. As reprehensible as they are, the focus right now, at least within the U.S. government, is on supporting practical steps that we can take to lay the groundwork for accountability and transitional justice with respect to Syria, including supporting efforts by Syrian civil society and international organizations, including the UN Commission of Inquiry, to gather evidence and help to eventually build the case, to assist many of these efforts that we've heard about, to prosecute responsible parties, whether they're on the government or the opposition side, even though most of the atrocities have taken place and been directed, it seems, by the government. We support these efforts, but also not just those pertaining to abuses of detainees, sexual violence against women, and by the way, a larger amount of these sexual-related cases have actually been perpetrated by the regime against those who are deemed to be sympathizing or families of the opposition. So it's not just ISIL's abuses against Yazidi women, for example. It's a much darker, bigger picture, thanks in part to some of the files that we have been able to get out of Syria, that has really painted a more systematic targeting by the Syrian regime against its political opponents. But other efforts are, for example, the standing up of the Joint Investigative Mechanism that is currently still reviewing evidence and will be publishing, hopefully, and making public its report sometime in September regarding who is responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Now, while the number of those affected by chemical weapons is far less than those who have been possibly detained, killed, and displaced, there's a clear international consensus and a number of pretty good Security Council resolutions that hold all those parties in Syria accountable to the use, whether it's the regime or non-state actors. So we have supported the efforts of the GIM, as we call it. We're looking forward to its report that comes out in just about a month. As noted in the Geneva Communique of 2012, there needs to be a comprehensive approach towards transitional justice. I know people are worried, is the United States trying to cut a deal that keeps Assad in power or perhaps give him immunity? There's no such thing going on. Let me be very clear about that. While we are indeed trying to find a political solution to the conflict, that certainly the regime does not think is quite appetizing at the moment, and they are pursuing a military victory in Syria. So while we're pursuing a political solution, and it's preferable, and so far we think it's the only way to have sustainable peace in Syria, we've also ensured that the issue of transitional justice is part and parcel of transition. And that's enshrined in the Geneva Communique. We support a Syrian-led process which may serve to lay the groundwork for future transitional justice and criminal accountability and ultimately sustainable peace. On a side note, I was the first U.S. official who reviewed the Caesar files. I was working at the time with Ambassador Robert Ford as one of his liaisons with the Syrian opposition, the activists, the NGOs, many of the peaceful protesters that started the revolution. And in the summer of 2013, once Caesar had left Jordan, I had a surreal meeting at a McDonald's in Istanbul where a member of the opposition came to me. I was finishing a great dinner, and he opened up the laptop and showed me 50,000 pictures. Well, you can see them here. So there's a lot of people in the U.S. government that are personally invested in the issue of accountability. And we'll make sure that we provide whatever support we can offer to various accountability and transitional justice efforts. I'll stop right here, and I'm sure I'll be taking questions once I sit down. Thank you.
Thank you, Wael. This doesn't often happen, but I guess because we are live streaming, and this comes via Muaz Mustafa with the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Apparently, and as I mentioned, the Caesar photos are scrolling here on your left. They've been referred to a number of times by all three gentlemen. So Caesar is watching, and he has sent us a message. And he said, "I want to thank you for remembering the victims and for pursuing justice. But it's important to act, not just to speak. That's why I hope we can do more to stop the atrocities and applaud Congress for the important bill in support of Syrian civilians. Now, what Caesar's referring to is the Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2015, which is a bipartisan bill sponsored by Congressman Eliot Engel. 2016. My apologies. 2016 by Congressman Eliot Engel and Ed Royce. You can speak with Muaz and a number of others in the audience from the Syrian community and some of those from the Hill about the details of that. It's not just that in terms of we're dealing here with the executive branch and the executive branch's response to it, but there are sanctions looming. And I can tell you, as somebody who lived in Syria for a long time, there's one thing that those close to the Syrian regime really worry about, and that is sanctions. I mean, it makes it complicates their lives significantly in ways that we don't really even fully understand. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. And it's based on what Caesar has asked here. So, as all three of you have said, there's overwhelming evidence of atrocity crimes committed by the Syrian regime in Syria. And as well mentioned, others mentioned as well, they've been committed by all sides, but the overwhelming majority have been by the Syrian regime. There's this chain of evidence, some of which we can see here. And there are a whole host of violations that Ambassador Rapp outlined. So my question to you, because I honestly don't know the question, usually I ask questions I already know the answer to, is why the hell haven't we been going after them from the beginning? I mean, what is stopping the United States or its allies from going after the Assad regime for these atrocity crimes? Or do we usually wait for the war to be over and then pursue them? Or is there a lot more going on behind the scenes? And how does this all play out in terms of the political process that we're trying to deal with at the moment?
Well, let me jump in on that. And obviously I was in the U.S. government until August of 2015 and fighting all the time to lay the groundwork for accountability for these crimes. But this was not a situation like Libya where we were able to get the Security Council by 15-0 to send the case to the ICC. It was blocked by the Russians. The Russians were blocking, before we brought up the ICC, sort of any effort to sanction or to almost even criticize the Assad government for these crimes. So the kind of international things that we've had in the context of, for instance, the establishment of the Yugoslavia Tribunal or the Rwanda Tribunal by the Security Council, or the referral of Darfur or the referral of Libya to the ICC after the ICC came into being, were blocked. And there's no jurisdiction under the treaty of the ICC unless these crimes are committed by Syrians, unless Syria is a party to the ICC. Then crimes committed on its territory or by its citizens could be prosecuted, but they clearly are not. So that particular avenue was closed. And the kind of mixed court, I was prosecutor of Sierra Leone, which was an agreement between the government of Sierra Leone and the UN. The government of Syria wasn't going to agree to a court that would independently prosecute its crimes. So those sorts of vehicles have been blocked. And as we were dealing with this, we also recognized that there could be these third country prosecutions, but that would take time. One, you'd have to be able to identify that you had a dual national among the victims, and you could then begin to develop the documents to show who's responsible for that crime. That will take a great deal of energy to do it right and do it according to the standards that we expect of U.S. attorneys or European prosecutors, or to have the perpetrators begin to turn up. And for a long time, the perpetrators are there continuing the torture. They're not on the road. So the important thing then was to do the documentation. And from early on, the United States and other governments supported a commission of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council. Couldn't go through the Security Council because Russia would veto it. But the Human Rights Council, which the United States has been a member of 5 of the last 6 years, it was able to pass a resolution by 40 votes yes and 4 or 5 no at the most to create a commission to investigate and to write narrative reports. Our concern in early 2014 became that wasn't enough, that they were writing good narrative reports, getting headlines every time they issued them, But they weren't collecting documents, they weren't collecting videos, they weren't doing that. They were basically interviewing refugees and have begun to do some other things as well, but they weren't in the business of documentation. That led the U.S., under Secretary Clinton, to go to Istanbul in April of 2012 and announce that we wanted to have a documentation center, which at that point we called it the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center. We proposed it. We got other states to support it. It was stood up with an independent board. Our friend Mohammed Abdullah, I don't know if he's here today, is here in Washington working it. It then supported other documentation efforts in Syria. All of them had to be a partnership between the international experts and the Syrian victims and survivors. But one of the most successful was this group, CIJA, which received $1 million funding to begin its operations to collect these documents. Since then, it now has a budget of almost $6 million a year as it collects these documents and employs 135 people, a majority of them from Syria, but also people that are ex-tribunal prosecutors and investigators putting this kind of thing together. So we are laying the foundation for it. And of course, we didn't prosecute the Nazis until we beat them in the war. We didn't prosecute the Rwanda genocide until 800,000 were dead and the genocide had ended. In the case of the former Yugoslavia, a court did begin, but it didn't really become effective until we had peace at Dayton and then until we had the end of the 99 intervention and Milosevic being thrown out by his own people. Then we began to get some of the high-level suspects. So it does take time to get justice. You don't expect it like a bank robbery next door. They pick up the bank robbers, you've got a trial in 6 months. It's not going to be that way. But, and that's discouraging to people who would like to see justice right now, who would like to see, as we had in the case of Bashir, as we had in the case of Gaddafi, even international arrest warrants out there. But it was very hard to get those arrest warrants answered while those leaders were still in power, to be frank. Sometimes you can do it. Sometimes you can create situations like we did in Liberia with Charles Taylor, who, after the arrest warrant was unsealed, he was basically close to being overthrown in his own country and left and eventually became available to arrest. But you don't necessarily have justice right away. But people have become discouraged by the fact that this conflict has gone on so long and there has been so little in this area compared to some others, at least symbolic actions. I can understand it. But they shouldn't interpret that the absence of trials today for a statement that there won't be trials tomorrow, because there will be. And we want fair ones, and we don't want victor's justice. And clearly there are people in the opposition, not just ISIS, that have committed horrible crimes, and they should be held to account too. And the best place for that is in a future Syria, with a democratic country, with all the communities represented in the courts. So it's not a case of who won the war and their people are going to be off scot-free and everybody else prosecuted. That's what we want to build toward. But in the short term, now with the impact of this, with the hundreds of thousands of refugees in Europe, we now are getting into a situation where we do have criminal jurisdiction, and cases will begin this year for these crimes.
Excellent.
No, I mean,
Yes, it's on.
no, I mean, Ambassador Rapp, I think, laid out
Speak into the microphone.
laid out the challenges quite well. It certainly has taken time and will probably take more time. The issue of access to investigate on the ground is almost impossible. So prosecutors will be relying on things that have been smuggled out, which in the case of the Assad files, I think there's plenty of material to sift through for future prosecution. On the council, I can tell you firsthand that it is virtually impossible to get any real, whether it's sanctions or censure of the Syrian regime, given Russian and at times Chinese position really on the council. It doesn't make it right, but that's the fact. Is in the case of the Russians, they're party to the conflict and will not agree to measures that will have any meaningful impact on the Syrian regime anytime soon. Now, we were able, in the case of the Joint Investigative Mechanism, to secure their support for standing up this body. Now, there's debates on why they actually went along with it. My sense is that they know that whatever the JIM will come back with, that report has to go back to the Security Council, and then the Security Council will be asked to act. So they basically have a shot at expressing their displeasure with the report should it point to the regime at that point. But still, it would be quite a bold move on their part, I would say, to reject the findings of a body that the Russians helped create and supported its mandate. So we will see. It's to be determined. It's going to be, I think, very interesting to see what comes out on this front. And it's true, the USG's efforts right now, because of the obstacles, is on supporting documentation. But also, and I know we catch a lot of flack for that, is supporting an end to the conflict that we think is the most important step right now, and ushering in a period in which credible transitional justice can take place. Trying to reach true accountability now is going to be almost impossible, if we're honest with ourselves. However, with enough evidence, I think certainly there could be certain cases where prosecution would move forward against certain elements of the regime now if there is undeniable evidence and a case built against them. And I think you'll see us being supportive of that moving forward. So, but people should not conflate the difficulty of this issue with either the USG being happy about the current state of affairs or in some way suppressing the process from moving forward. I can tell you that firsthand.
Okay. So I'd like to open up now for questions. So please raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. We'll start out with Barbara Slavin over here on my left.
Sure. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, and I'll monitor. Thank you all very much. Ambassador Upp, could you tell us a little bit more about the cases that are moving forward in Europe? Could you mention any of the countries or any of the specifics about these cases? Thank you very much.
Keep in mind that particularly in civil law countries, they make no disclosures until they're prepared to actually arrest and hold somebody under a judicial order. So, and obviously I don't want to compromise anything in those investigations or in the process. I would say that the cases do involve situations where dual nationals are in the Caesar file and where the surviving family members are cooperating with those national prosecution authorities to prosecute the people who are responsible for the crimes. Now keep in mind, usually in national prosecutions, there are exceptions to this, most prosecutors would rather go after somebody that they can get a hold of today than somebody that's off in some foreign country that it may take them a decade to get into custody. Those of us at the international level, we're more willing to wait a long time in the case of somebody like Mladic, who took 16 years to arrest. But there are countries that will prosecute perpetrators that are outside the country and put out international red notices and let them know that they're wanted once those cases are built. But we'll also be looking for perpetrators elsewhere in Europe, for instance, that can be brought in and tried. Those may not be the highest level individuals. Those may be individual torturers or people that have been identified by those in the refugee stream as engaged in similar conduct. So we will see cases like that, high level based upon citizenship of the victims. We will also see what cases that have been much more common in the case of Rwanda and some of the crimes from Latin America that have been prosecuted in Europe because the perpetrators have gone there. And there are several major perpetrators that are in Europe now. And they've been identified and cases are being built against them. But those are particularly important cases not to let those individuals know. We don't want them heading to St. Petersburg or back to Syria. We want them a strong case that's strong enough that when they're arrested, there's sufficient evidence to hold them until the time of trial. But there are a number of these cases that are being made. And understand my own role in my current role with the Holocaust Museum and the Hague Institute are largely working on this issue of documenting ongoing crimes to assist national and international prosecutions in places where we don't yet have courts that have the capacity to go out and do it themselves. But I'm not sitting there saying, prosecute this guy or prosecute this guy. I'm trying to make sure that they know where their witnesses are, that they've got the evidence, that the connections are made, that the documentation centers like CIJA are open to their judges, to magistrates, investigating magistrates, and they are coming. CIJA has now moved from Brussels to Portugal, actually, its headquarters, but their investigators are going there and digging out these files and asking for additional information and then doing their own work. But there are a couple of these that are very close to the filing stage. But I know better than to say that it'll happen tomorrow. But I do think fairly confidently we'll begin to see this kind of thing this year. These aren't easy cases. Charles Taylor Jr. wasn't necessarily that easy a case, though we had some very strong witnesses in the United States. His crime was committing torture in Liberia, but he was found in Miami on a false passport because of UN sanctions flying through, and because he was present in the United States, we could prosecute him for torture abroad. He also happened to be a citizen because he was born when his father was a student in Massachusetts, but we didn't even need to have him a citizen. But it involved going to Liberia with DHS agents and FBI agents and finding the witnesses and bringing them to the United States to testify. Sometimes in European countries, they can go to where the witnesses are, take statements, and include that in the file. But to the extent these cases are never as easy as local crimes, and they have to be put together very well. But thus far, the record of European prosecutors in these present in cases involving crimes in Africa and Latin America is almost 100%. So I do think that we're going to have some success in the very near future.
If I could just jump in very quickly, I recognize that we are live streaming and that we said it would all be on the record, but the CIJA has some security concerns in which they prefer, if for anyone who is writing about this, that their location be Western Europe, if that is something you intended to put in the article. So that's something I spent a lot of time discussing with them when I was working on the piece when they were in a different country at the time.
Okay. Mohammed. Just wait for the microphone, sorry.
Thank you. Mohammed Ghanem, Syrian-American Council. Just a quick question to Ambassador Raab. Let's suppose that in pursuit of a political solution, some powers try to cut out a deal with the Assad regime by which or in which Assad would leave the country in exchange, let's say, for some sort of immunity. How would prosecution versus political deal immunity play out then?
Well, first of all, under international law, it's quite well recognized, and you see this even recognized in national courts, sometimes to the consternation of leaders like in El Salvador recently that struck down its 1993 amnesty law, but that amnesty law for serious violations of human rights, for atrocity crimes, serious war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, basically are not binding agreements. And whatever anybody signs, that will not bar a prosecution of that individual in the future. There's some people that regret that and say, it's too bad we can't make these deals anymore, but you can't make those deals. And frankly, I think the perpetrators know that. So it's not possible. And that's not to say that in the individual country, they can't proceed with their own transitional justice approach. Just because a person doesn't have amnesty doesn't mean they don't prosecute them. Most of us think that, prosecution should be limited to the very high-level individuals and that there should be other efforts to rehabilitate and to reconcile with others and to use the truth-seeking transitional justice measures in those cases. Those are questions that a country should make, and we see that kind of thing happening in Colombia now, where, frankly, having a transitional justice framework and the possibility of prosecution is essential to getting the people of Colombia even to agree to that, let alone to avoid the possibility of international prosecution by the ICC. But there's a tendency, I think, on the part of the international community to say if they can work this out in a way that establishes the truth and does provide for penal consequences for the most seriously involved, we're not going to disturb that. But as far as a binding agreement that somebody can't be prosecuted. It's not on. Now, that's not to say that somebody couldn't reach an agreement and he could go, and he could go somewhere where he might be hard to get to, et cetera. But one could never give him a guarantee that the day wouldn't arrive when the government of that country might change and decide, hey, it's time to send you. And I think perhaps a more passive approach is something that people can live with, but a deal is not a good thing. And do keep in mind that, I mean, I saw it. I prosecuted in Sierra Leone. In 1999, under Charles Taylor's sponsorship, they negotiated a peace agreement because the RUF, who chopped off thousands of hands and raped tens of thousands of women, they gave them amnesty. And this group would disarm, and it would engage in elections. They made Spode Sanko, who was trying to steal the diamond mines, the minister of mines. They made him vice president. Within a year, they didn't disarm. They shot people down in the streets who were demonstrating. They took peacekeepers hostage, killed some of them. It was necessary finally to defeat them. And then the government said, no, for the top leaders, no amnesty. And those kind of deals where you tell somebody you can get away with it, in fact, just get you further crimes. Impunity breeds impunity. And those that have studied this, people like Catherine Sinkink at Harvard, note that countries that actually face up to the truth, confront the past, hold people responsible, have much lower levels of violence in those societies thereafter. And this is not, it's not a question of peace or justice. It's necessary to have justice in order to have genuine long-term peace.
I have a question. Can I? Sure. I have a question for you, Ambassador Rapp.
Allowed to ask questions too.
We've discussed the geopolitical agonies at the UN Security Council in terms of bringing forth any avenue for justice, or at least in terms of referral to the ICC. Russia, but we can conceive of a scenario in which, down the line, Russia and China might not block a resolution to refer the situation in Syria to the ICC. But so then, what happens if, as you discussed, we have potentially a Grozny type scenario on our hands with Aleppo if the Russians are, in the scenario you described with the forced displacement followed by sort of anyone who's left behind can be targeted as in their eyes, legitimate target. How would those individual Russian actors who are making those decisions be held to account, given that they are voting on the UN Security Council and they're not, and Russia's not party to the ICC? What would be the hypothetical avenue to pursuing justice for that crime?
Well, obviously, the bottom line of this, and I was careful, though, obviously I think one could develop an aiding and abetting case against Russia now, and as we say, we have 45 of the attacks on medical facilities that may have involved Russian units, and my friends at the Syrian Observatory in London, Rami Abdel-Rahman, documented some particular attacks in their work. There's potential liability there now, but if you actually became part of this kind of Grozny rule kind of operation, and part of the sort of bombing of the city of Aleppo, everybody that didn't leave, and we know that relatively few are going to leave. They don't have any place to go. They don't feel safe leaving. Then you would have very serious war crimes. Now, of course, that would mean almost certainly, as if Russia wasn't against it already, that you wouldn't get a resolution through the Security Council. But that also means that that Russian commanders, people that are going to a meeting somewhere, could suddenly find themselves tagged in those countries,
national jurisdictions
for these crimes. So there could be jurisdiction if they want to, spend all their time, within the Russian Federation. Fine, maybe no, they're never bothered. There could be lawsuits. There could be efforts to seize accounts elsewhere. That kind of thing. The sort of things that my friends from CJA are very good at, and many of these people have, engaged, some of them, in alleged corruption and things like that. That could provide some resources and reasons to go after their money. So I do think that there could be some accountability. It would still be challenging. Do keep in mind the ICC right now is investigating Russia formally in regard to crimes committed against Georgian nationals in South Ossetia during the 2008 war. And if you commit crimes, because Georgia is a state party, so the ICC could sometimes get involved, but in the Syrian context, since the only state party in the neighborhood is Jordan and crimes haven't been committed on that territory, I don't think we're likely to get that kind of jurisdiction. But the possibility of justice is there. It's obviously much stronger in the case of Syrians who might be tempted, who might be even today thinking, well, it's heads, we win, tails, we don't lose. We'll find some safe place where some of our family members are and go live there. I think the message that needs to be quite loud and clear is forget that. If you want to commit these kinds of crimes, there's not going to be places that you're going to want to go live that are going to be available to you.
Get a microphone, sorry, here in the middle. Sorry, raise your hand so they can see you for the microphone. There you go.
Hi, Greg Rose, formerly at the Defense Department and formerly at the American Red Cross, dealing with genocide issues. I have two questions, just a quick follow-up on the Russia question. I don't recall there being accountability for what happened in Chechnya. And I would like to suggest that Russia, given that it already has some liability, and I've spoken on this in other settings and in panels, it's hard to imagine that they would ever agree to a procedure that would create judicial accountability in the UN. And I find that astonishing to even suggest they might. My question, though, is about, I'm a part of a group that's very involved in working with Ambassador Saperstein's office at State to deal with accountability judicially for the targeting of minorities in Iraq and Syria, genocidal targeting. And I'm wondering how this issue of ISIS accountability and al-Nusra and others fits into this question of accountability by the Syrian regime. In other words, some of us are working specifically on that issue, and it's clear that the State Department has not really developed a sense of how to deal with that. I would suspect because the Assad issue might lurk in a bigger way. And so perhaps, I guess you're currently part of the administration as an advisor to the ambassador at the UN. Does the administration have a position on that now? And I'm wondering, Ambassador Rapp, what it should do about that issue of targeting of minorities.
What I can tell you is the State Department and other agencies are actively looking and compiling evidence of crimes against humanity, of war crimes and genocide in Syria and Iraq that may have been perpetrated by non-state actors or the Syrian regime. Now, those investigations in terms of building our own internal understanding of whether there was systematic, right, that is the key here, an intentional purpose to these atrocities is ongoing. So they've not reached a final determination. What they were able to do was, in the case of the Yazidi community, because of basically the overwhelming evidence, some of it based on ISIL's own statements, that they wanted to wipe out basically the Yazidi community of northern Iraq and the Mount Sinjar area. It was definitely a quicker case to make. But if you see in the rollout language, they also, the decision was, for example, ISIL was responsible for crimes against a whole lot of other communities in Iraq. But in terms of the Syrian regime, that's ongoing. But personally, I think it's just a matter of time.
Well, let me, first of all, I don't want to minimize the horrible crimes that have been committed by ISIS, particularly against the Yazidis and other religious minorities in northern Iraq. And I don't want to say anything in this world is easy, but that is much easier than the Syrian context because the overwhelming crimes have been committed by Daesh or ISIS or ISIL, as we call it in the U.S. government. And they have no friends among the states in the world, though it's to some extent indicates the sort of low level of judicial accountability and the agenda that we haven't made more progress on this to date. Now, one of the things I can do now that I'm no longer in government is I will be out at I got the invitation yesterday from my friend Naomi. I'll be out in front of the White House tomorrow night at 8 o'clock holding a candle with others on the second anniversary of the beginning of the genocide against the Yazidi people. Ceremony between 8 and 8:30 tomorrow, and you're all invited. But it is important to take action on that. Now, we have had the Syrian Commission created by the Human Rights Council under Chairman Pinero, because some of these crimes were committed in Syria. They have made a determination that appears that genocide was committed against the Yazidis, not a determination crimes against humanity and other crimes against religious minorities on the Syrian side. And of course, Secretary Kerry made a declaration pursuant to the congressional mandate to do it within 90 days in March of this year, that the crimes against the Yazidis and other religious minorities constituted genocide. Still more work needs to be done to bolster that particular finding that was mandated by a particular date by Congress. It is important, I think, to open up the avenue for accountability for these crimes, because some of these perpetrators are coming into custody. We know Sayyaf, for instance, the wife of Abu Sayyaf al-Tanuzi, who was the money man of ISIS, who held Kayla Mueller as a hostage and used her as a sex slave. At the same time, they were using Yazidi women, both for his pleasure and also for al-Baghdadi's. His wife, who was involved in that, was taken in that Delta raid in May of 2015, has been transferred to Kurdish Authority. She's been prosecuted for material support to a terrorist organization. Obviously, she was fairly responsible for that. She's being charged, frankly, in Richmond for that crime because of the tie into the United States as well. She won't be extradited because she's an Iraqi citizen, and there, even though she may claim to be a citizen of the Caliphate, she's constitutionally protected against extradition. But she's not being prosecuted for the genocide, for this sexual slavery, which is a crime against humanity of the Yazidi women, in which she appears to be complicit. That's not giving much for the victims. But as we look and as we hope, Mosul will be freed one of these days. There are major perpetrators that are there in Mosul. Some of them may die in conflict or blow themselves up, but others will not. There will be individuals that should be held to account for this crime of crimes. And how to get there, one could have an ICC referral by the Security Council. It's not something Baghdad at this point wants to support, because it views the necessity of pushing Daesh out of Iraq and regaining the control of its country against this existential threat as priority 1 through 99, and accountability is like number 100. But it's important to lay the foundation for it. So it could be they could send it to the ICC, or the Security Council could. I tend to think the ICC is not the perfect solution here. The ICC generally only prosecutes 3 or 4 people maximum in each of its situations. It doesn't have a large investigative capacity. Under law, it couldn't use UN resources for that, and it's very busy in the cases that it's in. I personally support what the Canadians have suggested, which is that there be a UN investigative commission. Now, this is different than an inquiry commission. This is one that would hire prosecutors who speak Arabic and investigators and others that would build the dossiers very solidly and probably lead to a later resolution to establish a tribunal. Every time that's happened else in the past, it's been sort of a first step. Or it could send it to the ICC, but then the ICC would have the evidence packed up nicely. So I do think that that's a very important step that could be taken. Thus far, there's been a reluctance on the part of the P5 to support that because Baghdad's concerned, even though the Canadian thing would talk about the crimes, exclusively the crimes of Daesh, and not alleged crimes committed by other forces. There are some, but they're not anywhere near the Daesh crimes. So that's one step. Another step is, of course, to move forward with accountability in Iraq, and there's a lot of interest in the Kurdish region to do this. They need to do it in cooperation with Iraq, so this doesn't get caught up in this sort of independence issue of Kurdistan and get into that political thicket. But the Iraqi judges that I've spoken to and the Kurdish judges, and I was out in the region in April and spoke to many of the victims and survivors, want to see a mechanism established that would try people not just for the terrorism crime, but for the crimes committed against the Yazidi population, which without question were the destruction. I mean, this particular religious minority has faced 72 efforts to wipe it off the face of the earth in the past, but this is the most serious. I mean, and we're coming up this week on these anniversaries when thousands of Yazidi men and boys and old women were slaughtered in places like Kojo, and when the younger women, with a higher price the younger they were, taken into sexual slavery, and thousands of them are even today in this horrible situation. Of course, if they bear children, they will not bear Yazidi children, and so even if they don't die, it's genocide. But the kind of horrible crime committed against them physically is, as we recognize in the Rwanda Tribunal, where I was a prosecutor, one of the ways in which genocide is committed, even if you don't kill the particular victim. So genocide has been committed against this group. Horrendous crimes against other religious minorities, which constitute crimes against humanity, against the Christian population, the survivors of which I visited in the Ankawa camps, and the Shia Turkoman population as well. And there needs to be accountability for those crimes. And there will be perpetrators held to account, and it's important to get some of them and to try those individuals. Closer to the scene of the crime would be better in a court that's broadly representative of the communities in the region. But certainly any kind of mechanism for independent justice is needed. And before that, though there are efforts now to do the documentation, there's no reason why we can't get started.
I have a question concerning, the current issue that is receiving a lot of attention in Syria surrounds Aleppo, and the regime's recent move to cut the Costello Road, which was then highlighted and exacerbated by the shooting down of the Russian helicopter around Sarakab, and then
a long ways away from Aleppo.
Right. and then which was then hit with some sort of chemical agent in the last 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Again, details unclear. But so my question is, and you had alluded to this, Ambassador Rapp, in your presentation, but I'd be glad to hear from all three of you. So, given that Aleppo is now effectively besieged, it is surrounded. It's the largest city, about 300,000 or so are trapped there. And of course, this is not the first time that the Assad regime has used such tactics. They've used them in Daraya, they've used them throughout the country. So where do these tactics, which have been going on from the beginning of the war, where do they fall in the sort of spectrum of crimes? Are we talking about a war crime here? Is it and if if, for example, a third country, like, for example, Russia or Iran, is involved in that procedure, are they then involved in that crime or an accomplice to that crime, or how are these things handled and should be considered?
I don't want to get too technical or to dominate, and you've heard I give long answers, but I'll try to make it as quick as I can. Without question, one attacking medical facilities is a war crime, whether in a civil war or an international conflict. Intentionally attacking civilian objects or civilian populations, even if you've given them warning or whatever, is a crime. Forcibly moving populations is a crime. These are all war crimes under the Geneva Conventions, under customary law, recognized by Russia. Russia was one of the leaders in establishing the laws of armed conflict under their delegate to The Hague, Ambassador Martens. These are well-established rules. The question is who's responsible. Obviously, direct perpetrators are, but as we had in the Charles Taylor case, he was the president of Liberia. We prosecuted him for crimes in Sierra Leone, and he never set foot in Liberia, and he's serving a 50-year sentence today on 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. If you aid a group that is committing crimes, and that aid is substantial, and if you know that they're committing crimes with it, then even though you do not intend the murder of innocent civilians or the specific crime, you are responsible under international law. And it's that area where the Russians, to the extent you build the evidence of the substantiality of their aid and their coordination with the Syrians, are already in a situation where, not that it would be easy to find a place to prosecute, there could be criminal responsibility. But certainly to the extent that they become actively involved in an operation to employ Grozny rules or to kill the people that haven't left Aleppo, or create this sort of idea that they're all combatants if they're not gone yet, then they could become involved as co-perpetrators of that crime, and the case would be even stronger. So my message to them is, don't go there. Today, you may be effectively safe. Tomorrow, you're not, and you won't be. I know I myself, as long as I live, will try to find a place to hold these guys responsible and to build a file on them. I tell you that. And there will be people held responsible for these crimes. The day will happen. No question about it. We've established it. We've sent chiefs of state to prison. We've got President Gbagbo on trial in The Hague today. We've sent Charles Taylor, who's doing 50 years at the maximum security prison in Franklin, England, north of Durham. Doesn't like it at all. You know, Milosevic was held to account. Karadzic was convicted in March. The precedents have been established. There are ways to do this, nationally or internationally, so the day of justice can arrive. And these are crimes under the laws of war. I should also note that when you attack a civilian population as part of a widespread or systematic campaign against the civilian population, which can be on a political basis, that's also a crime against humanity. So it's not just a war crime, it could be a crime against humanity if we employ Grozny rules in Aleppo.
Okay, let's see, we'll take one more question. Josh Rogan.
Thank you.
Sorry, wait for the microphone,
Josh doesn't
Josh.
need a microphone.
I know you don't need one, Josh, but
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up, Ambassador Rapp, on what you just said. So, as you know, and you mentioned this in your opening remarks, the United States and Russia are considering joining forces in a real way inside Syria. There's a proposal that was given to the Russians by John Kerry to establish military intelligence cooperation with the goal of possibly establishing integrated operations in places like Aleppo and Idlib. If the Russians can be implicated for aiding and abetting, being co-perpetrators for participating in operations such as these, does the U.S. government, by extension, if they follow this proposal of John Kerry, open itself up to liability for aiding and abetting and even being co-perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria? Thank you.
Well, understand I'm no longer in government and not I'm not speaking for the government. That's liberating. But the second point is, in terms of everything that's involved in this arrangement, I'm not completely aware of. And as I understand, there would be positive elements in terms of the enforcement of cessation of hostilities, and we wouldn't have anything like the Grozny rules in Aleppo, and that we would have a more focused effort to go after terrorist groups. I mean, if you could get all of those conditions, in other words, substantially improve Russian targeting, which has been invariably now on the moderate opposition and not on ISIS, that could be positive. But frankly, we've not seen a willingness to go along with cessation of hostilities in the past. That agreements have not been worth the paper almost that they were written on. And the fact that they would be gratuitously last week announcing the opening of these humanitarian routes, which led everyone to believe that why do you need that unless you're going to go do this kind of intensive bombardment, something that, as I understand, the United States was unaware was coming at all. It doesn't indicate to me good faith on their part. And I think one has to be extremely cautious about getting involved in any kind of joint operation, knowing that at the same time, they may be doing other things, and one may be relieving their forces to go do those other things. Criminal responsibility, aiding and abetting, again, the law is, your assistance to the commission of the war crimes needs to be substantial. It needs to be knowing. It's not something where, and of course, we've been attempting, and in some cases successfully, assisting proxy forces. Are we responsible for all their war crimes? Not necessarily. We give them training, we have lay vetting, we do a lot of other things that aggravate people, but that actually immunizes us from being responsible. You might provide some assistance here and there, and they might do something bad that might not reach the ground of substantiality. So the dangers of us walking into complicity in war crimes ourselves, if we're careful, may be limited. But I think it's highly dangerous, and it's also dangerous in terms of what, and I always try to steer away from the political equation and deal with the accountability solely. But as we saw in Iraq, the only time we ever began to make progress in Iraq is when we allied with the Sunni community and began to be the protectors of the people in Western Iraq. And if we get perceived as those that are targeting the liberators and protectors of that community, because the Russians say these are extremists and we don't, and we get into this kind of issue, then I think we run the risk of undermining the future of Syria and certainly of our relationship with a democratic Syria. So I would be highly cautious about this, and particularly in the wake of what Russia was saying over this last weekend. I think would be something that I would not be enthusiastic about seeing the United States pursuing.
Okay, we are out of time, unfortunately, but I would like to thank all the panelists here today for what I thought were really excellent presentations. So let's give them a round of applause. This is not going to be the end of the road. It's just the beginning in terms of the Washington Institute is going to be holding a series of these policy forums throughout the autumn around this theme of international justice in terms of war crimes and so on. But we also have a number of other, we're following the most recent developments in the region as well as the presidential cycle gets moving. On September 9th, and we're going to sort of go quiet for the last part of August, as generally as part of the vacation schedule. We're going to have a policy forum on the anniversary of Operation Inherent Resolve in the beginning of that. We're also going to be covering a little bit about the chemical weapons issue and where we are in that, and those will be announced shortly. And in terms of the last but not least, in a bit of self-promotion, but definitely pertinent to this this setting, my colleague Ambassador Dennis Ross and myself have written a piece in the New York Times that will be out tomorrow that talks about this Russia deal, the cessation of hostilities, and really a lot of what we talked about here and the road ahead. And anyways, all of you that have been here today, and I know that you follow this issue closely, keep your ears open, let us know what's going on, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.